All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Maha Ibrahim. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for doing it. I love saying that name, by the way. It's great. She is a partner at Canaan Partners, which is a venture capital firm, a large one that distinguishes itself, I know this distinguishes itself, by being 40% women and 47% immigrants. You are not Donald Trump's favorite venture capital firm, for sure.
For sure.
She came to it after working at Qwest Communications, but before that, you kind of started with this is extraordinary, BA in Economics, an MA in Sociology, both from Stanford, then a PhD in Economics from MIT, and you were at BCG as well. So that little package of stuff is like out of central casting for like super impressive, like at any time. But what was going on when you were like a teenager that you're, at that young age, you're doing all these impressive, like, educational things? Like, what was the plan?
I get your reaction a lot.
Yeah.
And it surprises me because it feels like another lifetime ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm 48.
Yeah.
All of that was done over 25 years ago at this point.
Right.
And that's not to say that it hasn't affected my life and put me on this trajectory that I'm lucky to be on. But it just seems like I have evolved so much since then. Having said all of that, I grew up in Boston.
Yep.
I am an only child of two immigrants from Egypt.
Oh, wow.
Who themselves were very well educated. And I really didn't have a notion of another path, right? They were never strict with me. They were never disciplinarians.
Right.
But I just knew that I was going to push myself academically. And that's what I did.
So it's kind of a classic immigrant thing then.
Completely.
The sort of like when you meet people, parents were Russian, like when they came, back was in the Soviet Union. And it's like, yeah, mom was an astrophysicist and dad was like something. And first of all, that's kind of crazy that was true in the Soviet Union in the 70s. And they were like, yeah, of course I was going to be the doctor was the worst case. I was going to be a physicist or something like that.
I didn't know anything else. Absolutely. And that's just the way it went.
And so you end up working at Boston Consulting Group, which is a little bit cliche, right?
For all of 7 months.
Yeah. And so you make your way out of there into Qwest Communications, which is also another world.
There's a personal side to this, which is my now husband. Yeah. I started dating in college at Stanford.
Right.
He went to Harvard Law School, and
so he was a little slow in the academic thing too.
Completely. Like I mean, he's far below me academically. Absolutely. And nevertheless, he went to Boston for graduate school. I too was at Boston for graduate school. Right. I was at MIT. His program was 3 years. Mine was 4.
Yeah. So
I stayed in Boston an additional year while he came out here and started his legal career a million years ago. And so thinking I wanted to go into business, not academics at that point. I had made that decision probably halfway through my PhD time. I needed to find a job.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Right.
So BCG was just kind of an easy platform to find myself in. What I found myself in over the subsequent 7 months at BCG, which was such a long time, was being in the middle of this incredible tech bubble in Silicon Valley that I knew very, very little about, but knew that I wanted to join it. And that's why I made the leap.
Did you know about that bubble? Because I kind of came into Silicon Valley. It was kind of like a fantasy for me. Like I just always studied, like I read about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and it just seemed like a different world to me.
Totally.
Until one day I was working at Deloitte in San Francisco, and I was like, wait, it's here. Like this world is here, like around me. Like that guy's at whatever it was, Yahoo at the time or whatever. So did you think when you were a kid before that, did you think about sort of the Silicon Valley thing, or did it sort of emerge as you were at BCG?
So my mom worked for DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, when I was growing up.
Oh, yeah.
So I was around, and Boston at the time was very techy. I was around it, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. And when I was at MIT, during my dissertation, I would spend hours and days at the computer doing, SAS programming and data analytics and all this stuff because dissertation in economics at MIT is basically an applied math degree. And so I was doing all this work and it was so slow and so cumbersome. I'm like, God, there's got to be a better way of getting this done. Yeah. And then I call my boyfriend, now husband, who was at the printer he was at Wilson Sonsini at the time. He was at the printer doing, he was an associate on the Netscape IPO and he was on this IPO and that IPO. And I was like, God, that sounds so interesting and fun.
It is interesting and fun.
Right. Yeah. And we both entered this tech world in the mid 90s, right? When everything was just completely up for grabs.
When tech was cool.
Yes.
Did DEC, there's a famous book about DEC, right?
There's a few.
Is the Tracy Kidder book Soul of a New Machine about DEC, or am I getting that wrong?
I don't recall. I'm sorry.
Such a good book. But the 90s was that's when I kind of came to see the internet. And it's still very cool, but at the time, I just remember the first time you kind of modem into some computer, and I was in San Diego, and I was like, I'm in a computer in Minnesota. And that was just kind of mind-blowing. Now, people have little phones in their pockets and cars show up and they're going to build a flying thing. But at the time, just being on a modem and getting into a computer at a university kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, and that's what it was, right? We'd have these computer labs. And for me, I was looking at all of this data, this government data, and to the point you're making, it was all over dial-up, and we thought these were like massive data sets, and looking back, they were nothing. But
looking back,
it was awesome.
How far ahead do you think you saw? Like from that, did you think, this is going to be, did you see forward to, okay, maybe people will be selling things online? There's no way you saw forward. Well, maybe you did, but to the phones calling cars, but
not at all. I mean, the way this world has transformed, think about it, in the last 25 years.
It's insane.
Crazy.
I watch.
I'm not sure for the better in some cases,
that's
right?
True.
Because we're just so fraught with anxiety generally, but it certainly has improved many aspects of life.
Yeah, I went to Dave Schwimmer was in my fraternity, and so he had an okay career. But I was watching a Friends episode recently as a result of that, and there's like no cell phones anywhere.
Yeah, really.
Yeah,
of course.
They're like the one thing that dates that show is they have the portable phones at home that pull out, but there's no concept of like, I need to text her and have her come over kind of thing. It all kind of happens in the real world. So you end up so how do you get out of BCG so quickly? I mean, shouldn't you spend
I just needed to go, right?
The consulting grind.
I was working on a case of a big electric utility in Northern California. Yeah. I was looking at what at that point was a tech business, which is a wireless startup. And that was exciting, by the way, but, looking back on it, it was pretty staid. And so I just said, I got to get out of here because there's way too much going on.
And you ended up at a tech company, but
yes.
It was it was Qwest Communications.
Yes, which at the time was a startup. It was 1,000 people when I joined,
right.
And it was within 2 years, 15,000 people. So this was a company where it was, they were in Denver, but it was the wild, wild west, right? You walk in and everything is on fire, and it is, all hands on deck doing anything you can to build out the network.
And weren't these companies like the telecoms, weren't they run by kind of, I don't recall, like kind of characters? Like
megalomaniacs, absolutely.
Right, there's some guy up in Canada, Maha, and then
and then
Qwest was some guy,
the MCI guy who I think is still in jail, Bernie Ebbers.
Right. It was fun. But
Joe Nacho, who was my CEO, went to jail.
Right.
It was a crazy time.
What was going on? So I guess you'd have to be that ambitious to say I'm going to they were laying fiber optic cable everywhere.
Right. So the notion of broadband in 1998 didn't exist, right? Or was just starting to exist.
Because who would ever need that?
Right. So we were building it. We were building out broadband networks, and we had this commercial that I'll never forget. It was this commercial of this motel in the middle of Texas, like Marfa, Texas. Yeah. So just like some dry landscape. where the person walks in and the person at the counter says, we can give you any movie, anytime, anywhere.
I kind of remember this commercial.
And that was it. It was all about delivering content to the middle of nowhere.
I remember that.
And so, but again, at that time, the content wasn't built out. The last mile networks weren't built out. So it was just a complete vision, which obviously today has come true, but it's taken a while.
Like just today. Relatively recently, they just started using all that fiber.
Yeah.
I think we just got Sonic brought fiber to our house for like the first time, and we're watching TV over the internet now.
So think about in 1998, when you are literally laying fiber into the ground, having that vision.
Yeah.
It takes a really bold set of people, and wealthy people, by the way, but a bold set of people to do that and make those claims and take those risks. So it was an insane experience, and one that I'm very, very lucky to have had.
Is it good to be those people? I talked to Mark Andreessen. He says certain things. He's like, for sure, the XYZ is going to happen, virtual reality, but it may be tomorrow and it may be in 10 years.
Yeah.
And I was early at Friendster with Jonathan Abrams. Really good idea, social networking. You wanted to be at the second one though, not the first one.
Without question.
You wanted to start Netflix maybe instead of Qwest and just use all of Qwest technology. Like, is it good to be those super pioneers? I guess if you're that guy, you're that guy. If you're the super pioneer
At the time,
person.
it was awesome, right? I mean, I stayed there for 2 years. Maybe I had the Silicon Valley bug before that was even a thing, where you just kind of cycled in and out of jobs after 2 years or so. But I stayed there for 2 years, and it was the equivalent of getting a PhD. I mean, it was such an amazing learning experience.
What were you doing there?
I was head of business development and head of what they called e-business. So mind you, when I joined, I was 27 years old.
Like you're way overachieving early on. Here.
Yeah, I didn't know what I was doing. I did not know what I was doing. And they put my office, when I got there, probably 5 doors down from the CEO and the CFO. And again, I'm this 27-year-old who knows, I basically knew how to pick up a phone. That's what I knew about telecommunications. And I just learned really, really fast and loved what I was doing. And we just had a lot of deals that we had to get done, right? So all that content that was on the network or that we were trying to get on the network, we had to do deals with those people. So people like Netscape and Yahoo, which are names from the past, but were so instrumental then, like Microsoft, as well as the network equipment providers.
Right.
All of them that went public in the late 90s, and most of them aren't there anymore.
And were there a bunch of women in this business? I mean, you're in Denver, telecom.
So there were 4 female VPs at Qwest when I left.
That sounds like a lot, but
it's not a lot. It's not out of 15,000 employees.
So it's not like 4 out of 6 VPs were women.
No, it wasn't a lot. No, I've always been in environments where there haven't been a lot of women.
Yeah.
And I'm now at a venture firm where, thankfully, that is not the case.
Yeah.
But when I joined Canaan almost 20 years ago, I was the only woman.
I have to, as I've talked to people on this podcast, a lot of women reference different points in kind of lost to history, where there were a lot more women in tech. Like they've got some time.
I agree with that.
I don't have this exactly down. Like, but talk to somebody like, oh, didn't you know in the 60s it was like mostly women? I'm getting this wrong, I'm sure. And then somebody said, oh yeah, the early internet, like there's a bunch of women that you've never heard of, but they built this and it wouldn't have happened without this person or that person.
Or even in the venture industry, I would argue that in the late 90s, there were probably more women partners in venture than there were, let's say, 5 years ago. Yep. Now there's been a massive transition because of activities that we've had to do, like All Raise, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and other programs that we put in place to get women into this industry. But for sure, when I started, there were many, many more females at the top than there were in subsequent years.
So you come into venture capital from Qwest, then is that how that worked?
That's right. So I was working with a lot of venture-backed startups at the time. As I mentioned, both content guys and networking equipment companies. And in so doing, I was working with a lot of VCs. And I didn't know anything about the industry. Interviewed with a few firms and said, just like I did with Qwest. I don't know anything. I don't know what I'm doing, but I know that I want to do this, and I'm going to jump right in.
It worked out last time.
Completely.
Is this the period when I had Julian Guthrie on the podcast who wrote the book Alpha Girls about Sonia? And
Yep.
Were they? But do you know they're making that into a TV show?
I do.
I'm waiting for the casting of it.
I know all of the women that upon which the book and the TV show are set, and I'm really excited for them.
I can't wait to hear the cast.
Yeah.
And the woman, I don't know, it's being done by the production company is called Well Entertainment, and it's run by this woman who. I wish I had this story. It's she somehow got sideways with Michael Ovitz in Los Angeles. And he somehow, not somehow, he's Michael Ovitz, like bankrupted her. It's like she's got this crazy story and she somehow came back. So it's been, and the woman's directing it too. But the casting has got to be so interesting. Like,
I better be.
Who's going to play you? So are these women are kind of in the mix when you come in, or they're probably before you a little bit?
So I'd say that they had been in the industry for probably, anywhere between 3 to 10 years before me.
Right.
So we all have close relationships at this point because we've been through this for decades, and some people have left their firms and started new ones, and some people have stayed at their firms like myself. Others have left the venture industry and angel invested.
Right.
So there's been a different path for everybody.
It was interesting talking to them or talking to Julian about their experiences compared to talking to Ellen Powell.
Yeah.
Later and Anne Duane, where they had a very, I have to be really careful I say this, but their attitude is very much like live and let. They were sort of like, yes, all those bad things happened, and we just did this to adapt to it.
Yeah.
As opposed to like recent people who have completely upset the apple cart, not okay, called people out, people lose jobs. That wasn't happening in that period. They were just sort of making it work somehow.
Yeah, I agree. And I certainly would say that while I didn't have similar experiences, I certainly had a similar reaction as they did. I'm very, very lucky to have landed at a firm where I've never had an issue like that.
Yeah.
I've certainly seen biases outside of the firm, but never internally. And I chalk that up to nothing but luck.
Right.
Now is a different time in many, many ways. And Ellen and what she did certainly helped catalyze it. And we all should be very, very thankful for her voice. It was and is an incredibly risky position to put yourself in.
It's insane.
Yeah. I don't think I would have come up with the same answer that she did.
Yeah.
Because I don't have that courage. But I am so thankful that she did, because it really laid the groundwork for a lot of people. And at the same time, social networking and social media has caused voices to be amplified.
Right.
And has had conversations being started that otherwise would have been in rooms of 2 or 3 people. And all of a sudden, these conversations can be amongst 2,000 people or more. So I think that social media has been a huge variable in the reactions and the change that has happened in my industry.
Yeah, you can't really understate it was great having Ellen on the podcast, and she didn't even talk about sort of when she came public with her things, the sort of forces that arrayed against her. Like if you kind of think back, all these articles got written in the New York Times. How do a bunch of articles get written in the New York Times? Like that wasn't the New York Times just investigative reporting. There was some dark force somewhere like pushing against her. And then she goes on and has another great experience at Reddit. Like, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it is. It is.
What she's accomplished.
And she has such a force behind her.
Yeah.
I actually never met her.
You haven't?
Right? No, I've never met her. And I follow her religiously on Twitter. I've certainly kept up with her career. But I'll say from afar, I'm a big fan.
She's lovely.
Anyone with that level of courage and grit is just awesome.
And she's a lot like warmer and funnier in person than you would imagine from her honed, what she has to put forward when the media's coming.
Of course,
after
I mean you have to have some level of armor to deal with all of the crap that she's had to deal with.
How do so why did you come into venture capital? Like, why aren't you running from knowing telecom? Why aren't you running YouTube or one of the big, telecom facilities. Like it's like there's a million jobs at YouTube or whatever there is at the time. There's like 10 in venture capital.
Why not this though? I mean, you could ask me the same question. I've never been one to plan out my career. I've never been one to, with the exception of getting a PhD, I've never really been one to set goals of, in 10 years I'm going to be doing this, or 5 years I'm going to be doing this. And it just felt at that time that it was a cool place to be and something that was really exciting. It scratched the itch of having, it scratched the intellectual curiosity itch that I had.
Right.
So continuous learning, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was kind of a simple decision. It wasn't anything that was.
And you did it for more than 7 months.
Yeah, 20 years almost.
Why do you think? Why, when you want to enter now, why are there so few women in venture capital? And like, there's women in, maybe not in trading, but in finance, there's a lot of women in all kinds of things. You go to Goldman Sachs, there's all kinds of, maybe not running the firm yet, but VPs and all kinds of things. And venture capital, it just seems like it's not a low number. It's an incredibly low, like a weirdly low number.
Yeah. So this does go back to my education. At Stanford, I have a master's in sociology, which is basically social psychology. And it is all about social psychology. Right. It's all about group dynamics and how decisions are formed and how similarities happen in small groups versus large groups. And that's what it is, right? We have an industry that is made up of collections of tiny groups. And when groups are tiny, they tend to be homogenous. It tends to be about me having trust in you, Kent, because you maybe have the same background as me, or maybe from the same place, or grew up in the same way as I did, et cetera. And so I'm going to have an affinity for that person more than I would some other person that has a completely different background than I do. And so these groups start forming based on trust. And then as they expand, they want to expand by bringing other like people around the table. And I think that's why our business is so homogenous.
Yeah.
And it's only because of these external forces that have happened in the last couple of years that this industry has become more diverse. I'll say I'm susceptible to it as well. I have hired many analysts at this firm over the last 20 years. And as I look back, every single one, and I'm not overstating that, every single one with the exception of one has been either an immigrant or a female.
Wow.
So we all have our own biases.
Yeah.
Right. We all have them.
Right. It's such a, I make fun of it all the time because you listen to how people got a job in venture capital, and so many of them, we go listen to podcasts where venture capitalists are interviewed. So I was like, oh, I just fell into it.
Yeah.
Now,
totally.
First of all, it's an amazing job. So you should at least make up some story like you wanted to be a venture capitalist since you were 5. But they always fell into it from, well, I went to Stanford. They didn't fall into it from the housing projects in Chicago.
Sure.
They fell into it from either Stanford or Harvard or Princeton, as the case may be. But
yeah, we all have these loose networks and we fall into it, like you said.
So what happens over time? Like 2017, what happened? Like all of a sudden, was it like people started losing their jobs? Like venture firms went away over this sort of Me Too movement. There was 500 startup. I did a podcast and I started writing them down. It was like 8 or 9 people left. Some partners quietly left it. Some bigger firms got away with quietly retiring. Some firms like Binary Capital went away. Like, was that a good thing? I assume it was. And what happened?
I mean, I lay that at the feet squarely of, again, both what Ellen Pao did and social media.
Yeah.
The power of the social media to amplify the egregious behavior of those few was powerful. And seeing that in the light of day, in black and white on your screen, people can opine. Everyone can opine. And VCs, we hate bad press, right? It's the old adage of no press is bad press, or what is it? No press is bad press? All press is bad. Whatever. You know what I'm saying.
All press is good.
All press is good press. Thank you. Duh. God, it's like
you just don't want to be forgotten.
Yes, you don't want to be. That is not the case in my business.
Right.
Right. We have to be open door, a place where entrepreneurs of all colors, any gender, any background feel like they can walk in the door. And when all of a sudden you are seen as being biased in one direction or the other in an overt way like that, I am so glad it is being brought to everyone's attention.
Right. And what of the entrepreneurial side of it? If you set out and say, I'm going to invest in more women, people of color, is that a good economic strategy as well as it's a good thing to do? Is it a good economic strategy?
So we're in this business to make money.
Right.
And I am a financial services employee. I am in that sector of the economy. So first and foremost, I need to make money. Period. Full stop. How I make money is a different story. It just so happens that because we have many women at Canaan, we have funded many women at Canaan. That does not mean that we proactively say, I will only fund women. That is not the case. But what it does mean is that because we have more women, because we have more minorities, because we have more immigrants, we see a lot more diversity in our entrepreneurial base.
Right.
We attract them. It looks like a safe place.
Yep. And the simple thing, it's interesting, when I worked at Deloitte was very much about, at least when I was there, about promoting and advancing women as becoming a partner. It wasn't, they were good people, but it wasn't because of that. It was because they needed to hire accountants, tax people, all these people, and you just double your available workforce if you look at women. I assume with entrepreneurs, it's the same thing. Assuming that entrepreneurial talent is evenly distributed, well, if you're looking at women and people of color, you're doubling the number of people you're looking at as opposed to, young white guys who went to one of 3 or 4 schools.
That's exactly right. And again, going back to the social psychology thing, if I am a brown woman who is, let's say, 60, walking into an all-white male firm of 40-year-olds, the likelihood of them funding me may be less than them walking in to our door.
Yeah. Yeah, I had Miyoko Skinner, who has a Miyoko's cheese. It's a vegan cheese. She's a 60-something Japanese woman. And you wanted to invest in her. Like, that company is just taking off, like 5 phone calls a week from private equity firms trying to get into it. Like, and when you meet her, you realize you say, yes, obviously this woman's like a winner. What mechanisms do you think are helping women the most? Is it things like All Raise? Is it a groundswell of activity? Is it women help? Like, what is the mechanism?
It's everything, right? There's no one. If there was a recipe for how to do this, people would have done it years ago, right? All the people in the book that you mentioned earlier would have been championing that cause, but there isn't, right? There is something to be said for critical mass, for sure. And again, we are all now so socially connected that it allows us, like in the All Raise example, it allows us to band together, not unionize per se, but band together and make sure that we are doing everything that we can to lift each other up. What's happened, and I've said this in many other forums before, but we have a lot of women that have entered this industry in the last several years as something other than a general partner. What is incredibly important is that they do not leave, right? That they are not hired as a token and put in the corner without any guidance, any help, etc. And there are many firms that have hired women and are really putting their money where their mouth is. They are doing everything they can to empower them, to guide them, to mentor them, to give them enough rope to hang themselves with. And I applaud that. We've made tremendous strides. There's still a long way to go. But it's been certainly a sea change in receptivity to the gender discussion.
Right. Well, and don't screw it up too. The firm that Alan Powell was at had like a bunch of great women, each of one who has gone on and proved that they're great venture capitalists by actually starting their whole firm. They just had them all right there, and somehow they went one way and the women went another way, and they're doing fine, but no thanks to the support that they were getting at that firm.
Yep.
What what's a guy to do? Like, what's the, if a guy's like, you're not harassing anybody or holding anybody back intentionally. It's not getting done to you, of course, because you're a white guy. So it's not in your mind, but you kind of think, no, I want to be helpful. It feels like there's a lot of like, being a good guy. That seems kind of corny.
Sure.
Certainly signing a pledge is ridiculous. I mean, whatever. It's
somewhat insulting, I would argue.
Right. So should you just shut up and let everyone else? Like, what do you like? What would you like to see a guy who cares do?
So I'd like to have folks have empathy for what we are doing. By that I mean all of the conversations that I've had around this topic, it represents a small slice of who I am and what I do on a daily basis. It is a productivity tax, having said all of that.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sitting with you, for instance, not talking about my portfolio, not talking about my fund, not talking about my life per se, but talking about this issue, which I am happy to do because the conversations need to continue. Yeah. But there is no doubt in my mind that it is a productivity tax and that it, in a way, harms me and harms others because of the time it takes away from everyday business. Having empathy for that, at the very least, would be a really big thing.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. I did this. I did this with. We had a conversation with Charles Hudson, who's like a black guy.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, I spent a lot of time thinking beforehand, he's probably really sick of talking about being a black venture capitalist.
Real sick.
On the other hand, there's like two of them, so it's kind of interesting. And he in the thing, he's like, he's like, you were worried about asking that question, weren't you?
Yeah.
He's like, I'm happy to answer it, but I get why you.
Sure.
Tired of talking
Just
about
like I'm sure Ellen is sick of it, right?
Yeah.
Because she has so much more to say.
Yeah.
It's clear than what happened to her 10 years ago.
Right. For sure. Well, speaking of your portfolio, you have one of the great, the RealReal.
Yeah.
Is a fabulous, I love this story.
Who doesn't?
Because it's as I understand it, it's the woman who did pets.com, which ironically a lot of people made fun of back in the day.
Yep.
Not for any reason about the business. They just had a very notable ad, I guess, and it sounded ridiculous. Ironically, you can now order pet food from Amazon. Ironically,
Chewy.com, I think the market cap is around $7 or $8 billion. Yeah. It might be even more than that.
Right. And so she's not crushed by the experience, or maybe she is, but somehow she, like, what happened and how did you find her? And it's the punchline is the RealReal is now a multi-billion-dollar company that has gone public and widely respected both as a financial outcome and as a company. How did you come to that company, and how'd she come back from her?
So her story is one that she should tell, but I will say that I respect her incredibly, like an incredible amount, because she is the most resilient, most optimistic, most positive, most breakthrough walls entrepreneur I have ever met. And I don't think anyone who meets her thinks any different. Their reaction to it is different, right? When she was raising her seed in Series A, and I remember this because I was along the ride with her at the time, she was getting doors shut in her face constantly.
Really? Because
she is an older, middle-aged woman who is in e-commerce and had a failure. Big deal. Yeah. What I saw was a woman who knew e-commerce better than any entrepreneur I'd ever seen. Knew the metrics of her business and what she needed to do to create value and the vision and have customers coming back. She knew that already day one. Yeah. And I mean, I can't say that about many entrepreneurs in e-commerce when did we fund the company? 7 or 8 years ago. Now I can say that, but at that point in time, it was slim pickings.
When did you get involved with her? At what stage of her
company? It was
company?
the Series A, so it was her first institutional round.
Yeah. Oh, so you really took a bet on it.
Yeah. And it's so strange as I look, it's so admirable, I should say, as I look back to those early days, the vision of the company, and I cannot say this about many portfolio companies, by the way, the vision of the company has stayed true throughout the growth.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that what you see in a lot of your companies? They start as one thing and end up as something else.
We're early stage investors. So we are investing with 5 people in a business plan sometimes, maybe some revenue. Our companies pivot. We know they're going to pivot. They might pivot 5 degrees or they might pivot 90 degrees. Hopefully not 180, but they're going to pivot. Yeah. This one never did. Never did. She had it right from day one.
And it worked out.
Yeah. And more so, she had the forethought and the drive. She just knew it in her gut, and she was going.
So how have you evolved as a venture capitalist you haven't hopped around firms, you haven't hopped back and forth to running companies. You've really done it successfully for a long, long time for venture capital.
Yeah.
Like if you're working at Deloitte, people be like, well, you haven't been here very long at all. But in this industry, people do a lot of bouncing around.
Sure.
How do you think you've changed over that time as an investor?
Or a person?
As a person.
Yeah. That's such a hard question.
Do you think you know more now, or do you know less?
I know more about what's important. I would say I know less about things that I choose to not think are important.
Yep.
That is I think my aperture has narrowed in terms of things that I tend to focus on, whether it's spaces or types of companies, et cetera. And also my reactions have narrowed, right? There aren't as many highs and there aren't as many lows.
Interesting.
That's not to say I don't get excited, and that's not to say I don't get stressed out. But earlier in my career, I was fraught with insecurity, and I was, this is a long-term game. And for somebody who, as you said, for somebody who, was going to Stanford and doing this and that, I was used to succeeding.
Yeah.
Of course, you do X and you get Y. That is not this business, right? This business is so much about luck and timing.
Yeah.
And when I finally accepted that, and I've accepted it, I'd say enough, not fully, but when I finally have accepted that, it's been a relief. I certainly don't stress out as much as I used to.
I mean, it can't be all luck, because you wouldn't be doing it for multiple funds.
It's luck favors the prepared mind, that old adage, right?
Yeah.
We do as much work to drive theses, to prosecute areas, to get in front of entrepreneurs that we're excited about, to be known in a certain sector. But ultimately, we make money during good times. And we make, whether it's good macro times or good times in a certain sector. And yeah, so much of that is nothing to do with anything but timing.
How do you feel the market has changed over that period? It feels to me like there was a period where it's sort of, you went from Facebook and things like that came along, and suddenly a lot of people in the world were like, wait, these aren't $100 million things.
Yeah.
These are $400 billion. These are the biggest value creating things on the planet. And that attracted something like people,
Sure.
energy, money. But you were there before that. How is this?
I look at it as this, the corollary to this is there is a statement that I have around today. But back then, when you were at Friendster, you were at the beginning of this wave. Mm-hmm. And to the point about timing, we make money when we can understand how that wave is going to evolve and how big that wave is going to be. So if I joined the industry 15 years ago and could see, or maybe 12 years ago, could see where mobile was going and where the social networks were going, and if I could place bets then on mobile-enabled anything, pretty much, I was going to win.
Yeah.
Right? The transformation of industries, whether it's travel or gaming or transportation or communication generally, right? Mobile has changed so much. And you've look at the social networks, not Friendster, unfortunately, but Facebook's revenue largely is mobile driven now.
Yep.
Whereas when it went public, it wasn't.
Right.
So if I was investing back then, I was riding that huge wave, and it hasn't crested yet, but it will soon. Right? And that naturally leads to where are we today?
Yeah.
And the thing that I worry about most today is that there aren't that many transformational changes afoot.
Right.
We will make money in certain areas where there are big transformational changes, but horizontally, having mobile, having social, both layered on top of each other at the same time was a game changer for this industry.
Right. And you don't think there's one of those right now?
There are in certain sectors, like a crypto, for instance, or esports, or some things that are happening in the enterprise, for sure. But they are not horizontal.
Right. Do you think the people who invested in those things knew that at the time, or if they just kind of, in retrospect, put together? Because I feel everyone explains to me very cogently, oh, right now what's going on in blockchain, you can do this and that. I'm like, yeah, but the guys who invested in Facebook just kind of couldn't get into the other 5 social networks. And like, really, is what happened. Like
a lot of what we do is placing bets in certain sectors, thinking that they're going to be big, and none of them meet expectations, right? Yeah. They're all going to be bigger or smaller than what we expect. That I know.
What do you make of these companies now that go public? How do companies like Uber or whatever not make money? Like this thing where people are coming public and they're losing so much money, but they're clearly creating value. They're clearly transforming how transportation works. They have a business model. They charge you for the rides. It's not some weird eyeball idea. How is this possible? From Microsoft went public, I think it had a PE of like 8 on its profits.
Yep.
Like its cash profits.
The Uber Lyft issue, I think, is a distinct one in that my personal opinion, the economist in me, looks at those businesses and says, ultimately, they are public goods, right? They are doing a massive benefit to the public at large. And as a result, probably should get a little more clearance on the profitability argument than a company otherwise would. Having said all of that, had Uber and Lyft merged years before they both went public, and there were talks of that, everybody knows it, right? Had they merged years before, I think the merged entity at this point probably would be profitable or close to it. Both of those companies have artificially kept their rates down, had to spend tons of money marketing against each other that they otherwise wouldn't. Right. So it just so happens you have 2 identical companies that have gone public that my guess is in 5 to 10 years will be one.
Like one regulated company.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Almost like a utility. Yeah.
So now, what are you excited, as you look forward, what are you excited about now at this moment when you come into work? Is it working with an entrepreneur? Is there a new technology out there that you think is incredible? Or what animates you now?
I have gone through peaks and valleys in this industry, and I'm just going to be real, right? There have been times where I've walked into work for weeks and I've said, God, you know what? There's this level of ennui. Why do I feel this level of, I've done this before, I'm not excited, etc. And then some crazy awesome entrepreneur will walk through the door and blow my socks off, and it will just revitalize my brain again. And that's the cool thing about this industry, right? Yeah. I get these periods where they're kind of these fallow periods psychologically. And I think if most VCs were real with you, they'd say the exact same thing. Because not every day is a great day. Right. Not every day is one where you're like, oh God, I'm just so excited to learn. Right. Right? Sometimes I'm just like, God, I can't. Sometimes I'm like, God, I just can't see anything incremental.
Yeah.
Again. And yeah, there are so many exciting areas right now. And I think that, a couple of weeks ago, I was going through this period of ennui for sure. And then I just started getting really excited about these two different areas. And
what areas are you excited about?
It just depends on the month or the week.
What is it?
And so I will, let me take this back. I've always, maybe to my detriment, been a very thesis-driven investor. So I will stick to categories for quarters, years, months at a time, and really just get to know everything about that space, get to develop theses in it, find the company that I want to invest in, and go for it. And sometimes I'm right, and other times I'm wrong. And other times, just, from the grace of luck, an awesome entrepreneur comes in the door and just fits in that thesis. And I'm like, absolutely, I'm going to run with it. Yeah. Right now, I'm feeling excited about a deal I'm thinking of incubating in the shopping and e-commerce sector. I fundamentally believe that sector is unsatisfactory to many people. When I want something that's not on Amazon, right? When I want something, it is unfortunate that I have to spend potentially hours, even more than like 15 minutes, trying to find the right product on the web, right? It's 2019. It shouldn't be like that. Mm-hmm. So I want something that I'm looking for something that is a much more intelligent search engine or search functionality, maybe not an engine, around shopping, which one can say has been done before, but to the point about Friendster, not in the right way and not for today.
Do you appreciate do you come in and go, this is just so cool that I can just listen to somebody and you haven't become jaded to that? Sometimes I am, but I'd say that's probably 10 to 20% of the time. Yeah.
Most times I feel incredibly lucky to be here.
How do you feel looking forward to venture capital over the next 5 years? Like, what do you think about the industry? Like, I've said this every year of my career. We're in a really weird period of venture. Yep. And I don't know what next year is going to hold. I don't know I've been wrong every single time, right? We all know there's too much money in the system. We all know valuations are are crazy. And at the same time, we all know the old adage of buy low, sell high. And it feels right now that we're buying high and hoping that we're going to sell higher. It really worries me. What also worries me is that we've seen a lot of people in this industry who've been here for 10 years and have not seen a downturn. Right.
And how this industry reacts to that is a huge question mark.
But we don't know.
We don't know. And that downturn might be in a year. It might be in 5 years. And if it's in 5 years, no one needs to worry about it today.
Either way, you're not going to be bored.
That's right. And either way, I know I can't time it. Yeah. There's no point in even trying to figure that out.
Is there anything else you want to do other than venture capital? Do you ever say, I want to go run a company
or
do something else?
Sure. There's two things. I know I'm going to tell you what I don't want to do, and then I'll tell you what I do want to do. What I don't want to do is be a founder.
Yeah.
And the reason why is
really good. I can tell you, having been a founder, that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
It's really freaking hard, right? And that's what I respect so much about founders. They put everything on the line for this idea. Everything. Yeah. Right? How it messes with your psyche, how it messes with your bank account, how it messes with your sleep, your health, you name it. Mm-hmm. It is all encompassing and very dangerous psychologically, right? And I don't have that risk profile. Despite the fact that I'm in venture, I know I don't have the risk profile that these people who walk through my door every day have. And that's something that I have to respect about them and understand, by the way. I mean, as venture people, we have to be empathic to the founder state, because it is so fraught with just everything bad and a lot of good, but a lot of bad.
Yeah.
So I know I don't want to do that. But I've been starting to teach a little bit on the side. So again, scratching the academic itch.
How do you like it?
For sure. I love it.
Yeah.
I always have. But my life is so crazy busy right now that doing that on a more regular basis just isn't in the cards.
Right. All right. Well, this has been fantastic. How do people get not in touch with you? I'm sure you don't want people just getting it, but how do people find you, hear about you, follow you? What's the...
So I'm on Twitter, Maha Ibrahim, at Maha Ibrahim. You can go to the website, and my information, email, etc. is all there. So one should feel free to send me messages or emails or business plans, etc. I'm happy to look at everything.
Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. This has been the Something Ventured podcast. Maha Ibrahim has been my guest. Talk to you next time.